Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. And next slide, please. We already introduced the title, so slide. This is the agenda for today. The first three parts I'll go over. So we'll briefly discuss the FDA's general role in regulating clinical trials under its jurisdiction. And then the bulk of the talk will be focused on investigational new drug application. And once you have one in place, what are the reporting requirements for maintaining an IND? Then Julia will discuss the regulations associated with informed consent, institutional review boards, and essential regulatory documents. Throughout, we'll have some best practices and challenges, and then at the end, of course, questions. Next slide, please. So what is the FDA? So the FDA is an agency under the Department of Health and Human Services, and it is responsible for regulating clinical trials under its jurisdiction. So for products under its jurisdiction. So basically you're talking about biologics, medical devices, drugs. They also regulate tobacco products and animal products. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm just highlighting the three centers under the FDA, which is the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, CBER. So they regulate biological products. And under the centers, there are different offices that are responsible for different types of products. For example, the Office of Therapeutic Products, this would be the office that would be responsible for regulating things like gene therapies, and of course, vaccines would be regulated under the Office of Vaccine and Research. The Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH, regulates medical devices. Medical devices is probably a discussion for another session, so we would not cover that in this talk. The Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, CDER, this is the bulk of, well, all of the NIDA studies are actually under this center. And under the center, you have the Office of New Products and, oops, sorry, 1 second. I lost my screen. Right, sorry. And for NIDAs, especially our INDs are reviewed under this Division of Anesthesiology, Addiction Medicine, and Pain Medicine. Next slide, please. So ultimately, the role of the FDA is to protect the rights, safety, welfare of clinical trial participants. And they do this by ensuring that clinical trials are designed and conducted, analyzed in accordance to the law, federal law, and ICH guidance for good clinical practice. At the end of the day, the FDA is concerned about providing the public with safe and effective medications that have undergone a rigorous evaluation by the time it gets to market. Next slide. So the regulations, the FDA regulations can be found under Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, and Title 21 deals with food and drugs. The regulations pertaining to human subject protections are Part 50, Part 56, Part 312, and then 812, as I said, is IDE, Investigational Device Exemption. Julia will discuss Part 50, Part 56, and I will discuss the Investigational New Application, Part 312. Next slide. So some definitions before we get started. I'm sure everybody knows clinical trial, what it is, but per regulation, it's defined as an experiment in which a drug is administered, dispensed, and it involves one or more human subjects. So clinical trials occurs in phases. Phase 1 being the initial phase where you're done with your animal studies, you realize it's safe to go into humans, and it's basically concerned with safety. The bulk of NIDA sponsored studies are phase 2 and phase 3 Phase 2 studies are concerned largely with efficacy, ensuring that the investigational product is effective in the population you're looking at. The phase 4 is after your drug is on the market, and of course the manufacturers are collecting more information for the drug based on risk and any other usable information. Phase 3 is usually the confirmation, so you'll most likely compare it with standard treatment, also gaining additional safety information. Next slide. And of course, we're talking about IND. So what is an IND? So the IND is basically a claimed exemption. The federal law states that in order for a drug to be transported or distributed across state lines, it has to be the subject of a marketing application, meaning it has to be approved. So in essence, the IND is granting you an exemption from that law. So it's required for interstate shipment and administration of any new drug or biologic product. And I say new drug, and the new drug is defined as anything, let's say biologic or new chemical article, but it has not been evaluated by people who are qualified to evaluate it as safe and effective for use under the condition that's prescribed or recommended or suggested in the labeling. So because of this broad definition, a new drug could be this, a new article, or a combination product, or an approved drug that's been used for a new indication. I have an example here of CTN, our CTN 110 study, which is using Sublocade, which is prescribed for opioid use disorder, but we're using it to test its effectiveness in treating methamphetamine use disorder. So in this setting, this is considered a new drug. New route of administration. So buprenorphine is sublingual, oral dose, and you have Sublocade, which is an injectable. PAM 203. So some studies on the NIDA that fit this this definition as being new drugs under this is the CTN 008 study, 98-99. So PAM now has been approved. It's now Brixity. But at the time of the IND, it was still considered an investigational product, new drug. Any approved dose, and if you're using the approved drug in a new population, let's say you're going from adult to children, that also falls under the definition of being a new drug. Next slide. So do you even need an IND? While you're in the CTN, most studies are not IND studies, so you don't need an IND for every study. So you ask yourself, are you using a drug that's lawfully marketed in the US? If the answer is no, then you definitely need an IND. If the answer is yes, and all of these conditions don't apply, you'll need an IND. If all the conditions apply, you're likely exempt, from the IND regulations. So the first two conditions criteria really is not applicable to NIDA-funded studies. We're not manufacturing. It's a nonprofit. It's academic institutions. So we're not looking to change the labeling or advertising for the product. In deciding whether or not your study is exempt, you have to look at the risk associated with any changes to the dose, to the route of administration, to the population. If you're to any modifications made to the drug, under the regulations, modifications are allowed. Some things like encapsulation, scoring, things for the purpose of blinding. So if any of these changes do not significantly increase the risk associated with the use of the drug, then you'll be exempt. And whether or not you're exempt, your study has to comply with Part 56 and Part 50, informed consent and IRB review. And of course, the last criteria is 312.7 that deals with promotion and commercialization of the drug product. So the question we get is, do you need to file for the exemption with the FDA? The FDA thinks, the FDA general thinking is that investigator sponsors are quite capable of making an assessment on risk themselves, but sometimes it's just not clear. So if it's not clear, you can go ahead and file an exemption. Other situations where you may need to file an exemption is the manufacturer. CTN, NIDA partners with pharmaceutical companies all the time. That may be a requirement for them to donate the drug that they want to hear the FDA say that is exempt. And sometimes you're sure, and then you send your protocol to the IRB, and IRB says, no, we don't agree, or we want to see the FDA say that it is. So that might be some situations where you would file the exemption with FDA. Now, we'll see the contents of an IND in the next few slides, but basically you will file the IND, all the information you will put into an IND, you will send it to the FDA for review. And then in your cover letter, you will request the exemption, and then you will list all the criteria here as to why you need exemption. If FDA agrees, your IND is exempt. As long as IRB approves, you can start your study. If they don't agree, the good thing is you already filed an IND, which you would have needed to do in the first place. Next slide, please. So there are two types. There are two categories for INDs: research IND, commercial IND. NIDA will always be a research IND. It's non-commercial. The studies you conduct, it's not intended for commercialization. And I put this note in because we do partner with pharmaceutical companies. And so results from your studies might be used by the pharmaceutical companies. For example, if NIDA study, the CTN 110 show that it's effective in treating MET disorder, then the pharmaceutical company may use data from that study to support their own commercialization. Next slide. So this is the general content of an IND. So you don't have an exemption, you have to file an IND. This is the parts that goes into an IND. So the cover letter is basically an overview of the application package. And then you have required administrative information. You have your Form 1571, which is basically a table of contents telling you everything that's contained within the application. Form 3674, it's your declaration that you're complying with the clinicaltrial.gov regulation in terms of putting your results on clinicaltrials.gov, etc. Now, the TORA document, this is a document that that tells the FDA the responsibilities, the regulatory obligations that are transferred or shared or remain with the sponsor. So we usually CCC draft this and we send it over. The sponsor lead node would review and make sure that, for example, the CCC would do monitoring. So this is one obligation that is transferred to MS on behalf of the sponsor, to perform on behalf of the sponsor. The LOA is a letter of authorization for sponsor authorized representative. So you want, basically you're authorizing MS to be the point of contact for the FDA. So you will sign, the sponsor will sign a letter stating that, authorizing that to happen. Table of contents that just tells you the content of your package. Your introductory statement is just basically background information, your investigational plan, what you plan to do, how you plan to analyze your data. The investigator brochure or package insert. Investigator brochure usually it comes from the manufacturer. package insert is for things that are
It's loose. Oh, okay, yeah, bag.
Products that are marketed, and the package inserts is publicly available. Your clinical component includes your protocol, ICF, any summary of previous human experience. This goes in this section, and you also put in your site and PI information. Basically, this is going to tell the FDA, hey, the PI is qualified, and then you're using a qualified IRB to oversee the study. And chemistry and manufacturing and control information, animal pharmacology and toxicology. These are the other big sections of the IND. In NIDA sponsor studies, because we don't really manufacture anything, all of this is available via what we call a letter of authorization for cross-reference. So basically, the manufacturer of the drug would provide a letter telling the FDA that they could go in and look at the IND or NDA that they previously filed with the FDA. So in terms of the package, we don't NIDA INDs. We just have like a reference refer to the letter of authorization for this IND number, this NDA number, for previous human experience, animal data, and chemistry and manufacturing information. Next slide. So in terms of IND preparation, usually this starts early during the protocol development phase. Lead node and CTN would notify CCC of plans for a potential IND study. In that case, we have the ability to see whether or not the study is going to fall under an IND, or if it's going to be exempt. Now, if we realize that this study is not going to be exempt and it's an IND, then we work with sponsor and NIDA to determine the timeline for when we want to submit. And just defining what a sponsor is. So the sponsor is the person or entity that takes responsibility for and initiates a clinical investigation. So this NIDA has sponsored trials, but lately the sponsorship role has been given to the lead investigator at certain lead nodes. So the funding agency, of course, is NIDA. It's the ones providing the finances, the grants to conduct the study. Now, once we receive the finalized protocol and ICF, that's when we start drafting the IND. All the contents that you saw on the previous slide, we would start drafting. From draft to submission, it takes about a month. So we will draft and then send it to the lead node for review and sign off. Best practice, we'll talk about this more on the best practice slide at the end, but it's for the initial INDs to submit sequentially. So to FDA, then IRB. Next slide. The FDA has 30 calendar days to review. And within that time, the sponsor may receive information requests. It could be clinical, could be CMC, could be non-clinical. You'll likely get clinical information requests first. The sponsor should be available during the review period, just in case there are questions. You're the subject matter experts, so you'll need to be on hand to answer any questions they may have. If the drug is being donated by the sponsor, should ensure that you have a representative from the manufacturer side that could answer any questions that may come up, any CMC questions, any animal data questions that may come up. We need somebody available to answer those questions. The general submission mechanism is via email. FDA predefined the turnaround time, sometimes as short as 48 hours. We've even seen 24 hours if they think you don't need time to find what they're looking for. And if at the end of 30 days, your study is safe to proceed, if there are no clinical holds, and sometimes you may hear earlier from the FDA that you can proceed as long as your IRB approves you're safe to proceed. Next slide. So I'm not going to go over all of this in the interest of time, but some of the things that can cause your study to be on hold, I'm going to highlight, this one. If your IND does not contain sufficient information to assess risk, and then your protocol, the last one, your protocol is clearly deficient in design to meet its stated objective. So if some of these conditions if all of these conditions are not met, or one or two, you could be on hold for a CMC issue, a clinical issue. So these are some things to keep in mind. Next slide. So you have your IND in place, and you are required to maintain the IND in good standard, and those are some reporting requirements. So protocol amendments, we'll discuss a little bit more in detail, includes things like new protocol, change in protocol, new investigator, information amendments, clinical safety, anything that really basically don't fall under protocol amendments would be an information amendment. Safety reports, notification of any SUSARs, serious and unexpected adverse events need to be reported. And then you have your requirement to send in an annual report. Next slide. So for a protocol amendment, any significant change that affects the safety of the subject, the integrity of the investigation, scientific quality of the study needs to be submitted. And it needs to be submitted contemporaneously. So that means before you implement your change, the FDA has to receive your submission. And these are just some examples of significant changes that would require contemporaneous reporting to the FDA. Any increase in drug dosage, duration of exposure, increase in your number of subjects, a significant change in the protocol design. Let's say you're dropping a control group. So you're changing your inclusion, exclusion criteria, things like that. The addition of any new test procedure that is intended to improve monitoring or reduce risk. This is not an exhaustive list, but those are some of the examples that will require you to submit an amendment to the FDA. Next slide. So when we submit amendments, basically we need an IRB approved updated protocol. We submit in clean and track changes so the FDA is able to see the changes. And if the ICF has been updated in line with the changes in the protocol, we also submit clean and track change for that as well. Summary of changes. So this summarizes what changes. So the FDA has a document that it could quickly look and see the overall changes to the protocol and ICF. Now I note that IRB reviews and FDA receives. So this means that changes can be implemented once IRB approved version is submitted to the FDA. You don't have to wait for FDA review or commentary unless you specifically ask FDA to comment on your amendment. So some sponsors have done that when they need feedback from the FDA, but they don't have to. FDA is not on the clock for a review of protocol, and they can come back and comment on your protocol anytime they want. We've seen protocols being submitted, and then 5 months later, the FDA comes back and said, there's something with your protocol. But the good thing is, once your IRB approves it, you don't have to wait for any commentary from the FDA. Minor changes can be provided at any time. During the annual report, sometimes when we send out another amendment, or when we send in another substantial protocol amendment. Next slide. Forms 1572, that's when, NIDA has multi-site studies, so new sites are always enrolling. So you have to submit site information that would include the 1572 and The PICV, you want to make sure you have qualified investigators. This is a potential whole issue, is if the investigators are not qualified to conduct the study. I highlight sub-investigators here. We'll discuss sub-investigators on the last couple slides. So for a new site coming on board, new PI, we need a new form 1572, the PICV. It's important if your PI is not a MD or a DO that we have a CV of a sub-investigator that's a MD or a DO. When do we need this in? We need this 30 days of the investigator being added. And I have 30 days of site being actionable. That is your site ready to enroll, or whatever market you want to put it, your site receives investigational products. What you don't want happening is that you submit a 1572 6 months in advance. We've had cases where 1572s have been submitted and the site never ended up enrolling any participants. So let's say you're 30 days out from enrollment. That's when you get your PI to sign this 1572. We'll submit it within that 30-day time point. There's an exception for the initial 1572, which we have to sign immediately before the IND submission. And this is just for information purposes, but because we have multi-sites, sometimes the sites enroll in close proximity to each other. So we would collect the 1572s and in batches and then provide one submission. Next slide. Updates to the form. If a new PI replaces an old PI at a site we previously submitted, we need to submit a new 1572 for that PI and the CV within the 30-day time point of when that new PI replaced the old PI. If the site where information was previously submitted closes, we just notify FDA in the cover letter. We don't need to submit a new form. Minor changes to the 1572, those can be accumulated, and we could provide a submission, let's say when we send an annual report or or information amendment or protocol amendment. In that case, only the updated form is needed. We don't need a CV if it has been previously submitted. Next slide. So the annual report is one of the biggest things we do for these studies. It's due every year, 60 days from the date of the active date. The active date is the date where the FDA says, hey, your study is good to go, you're safe to proceed. So within 60 days of that time point, we have to send this report in. So CCC, DSC, we get together a few months before the freeze date. This is the date, the anniversary date, where the data is frozen to collect the information we need to put the annual report together. We draft it, we provide it to sponsor for review and sign off before submission. So these are just the general information that we include. We give an update on participants that are enrolled, those that are still active, those who drop out, any results we may have. We would provide a summary of that. The most frequent and serious adverse events, IND safety reports if we submit it throughout the year. And important for FDA to know any subjects who discontinued because of AEs. And we would also tell the FDA plans for the upcoming year. Do you plan to add a new protocol? Do you plan to add more people to your study? Do you plan to stop enrollment, things like that? Any updates to the IB goes in at the time of the annual report as well, unless we have it before and we have a submission go to, we'll set it. Protocol updates that didn't go to the FDA, in general, we don't provide significant protocol updates in the annual report. Significant protocol updates should be their own amendments, but if we have minor updates to the protocol, we'll send it at the time of the annual report as well. Next slide. I'm not going to go over this, but other routine IND amendments is things, as I said before, mentioned information amendments, things like responses to FDA requests for information. This usually happens most frequently while the IND is under review. Meeting requests, those are other routine amendments you could have while the IND is active. Next slide. So the last couple slides, just going to touch on some best practices and challenges. We encourage the CTN, we encourage NIDA to use the avenue for pre-IND meeting. It's especially when you have questions about your protocol design or the study population. It is a best practice to have a pre-IND meeting. It mitigates having to make protocol edits to potential hold comments during the 30-day period. And for NIDA held or funded INDs, where we cross-reference most all of the non-clinical clinical CMC information. Generally, your full draft of your protocol is enough for FDA to review and provide feedback. So this is something we strongly encourage study teams to start doing. If you get in, if a manufacturer is donating drugs, have them on board early during the protocol development, so that, you know, down the line, nobody has wasted the time. Sometimes the manufacturer sees the final version of the protocol and said, hey, we don't want to donate our drug anymore. So have them involved as soon as possible. For multi-site studies with generic drugs, ensure that the sites know which manufacturers or brands they're using. This avoids the potential for FDA requesting individual package inserts for each site that opens. So if we know upfront that, you know, site X is going to be using this generic site, you know, site Y is going to, we could tell FDA upfront and potentially provide it upfront. This is big. We know the regs say you could do this simultaneously. You could simultaneously send to IRB and FDA, but we strongly encourage that you do this sequentially for two reasons. Mainly, you could have the potential of going back and forth between two regulatory bodies. So FDA is making changes on one end and IRB is making significant changes on the other end. Then you have to take both changes back to each body. So we encourage that for the initial IND, you go to the FDA first, then to IRB. That way you work on all the kinks with the FDA, then you take care of the IRB. And of course, RAPC last if you have a California site. For protocol amendments, we advise the opposite. Submit to IRB first and get your approval, and then go to the FDA. As I said before, the IRB reviews and FDA receives. You just have to submit to the FDA, and then you can implement your changes. So as long as IRB approved, let's say you submit your protocol today, and an IRB approved protocol today, you could start your study today, like implement your changes on the same day. Next slide. Responses to FDA requests for information. This includes amendments. You should solely just focus on what the question is. Do not go in excess. Do not add anything while your protocol is under review. If you're updating your protocol, this could potentially open more questions. So you're updating your protocol while the FDA is reviewing it or while the IRB is reviewing it, then you have to keep resubmitting updates that you made. For studies that require RAPC approval, we didn't have time to go into RAPC, but best practice is to plan for submission well in advance of expected enrollment start. RAPC meets, I think, about 5 times a year, and their review days are 30 business days. So, and then they would usually come back with change. Guaranteed, they're probably going to ask you to change something in your ICF, so you have to plan ahead. This is more so just noting that due to the complexity in design of some NIDA studies, it can be challenging at times to highlight and summarize key data points. So things like an annual report could have several tables that need to be summarized. Some things could get lost in this big summary. And the last point is because I got, I think I recently got a question on this about sub-Is on 1572. We've seen 1572s without sub-Is listed. And study staff providing significant support should be listed on the 1572. Now, the sub-I is not there to replace the investigator, but as I said, it's people who are providing support to the significant support to the study. And this guidance is really, really good. So I encourage you to look at it. It is a Q&A. It tells you line by line, box by box, what goes in the 1572. And that's it for my portion. I'm going to hand it over to Julia.
I think we're on 23. Excellent. Okay, so we're going to do an overview here now, starting of informed consent. So just seeing the folks that are on the call, I think most of you are aware of what informed consent is. So I'm not going to go into, the very, very basics, but what I am going to do is cover some of the regulations that dictate, the informed consent document requirements within the CTN. We follow those, and I'll also provide you with a couple of resources that help guide, your development of the informed consent form for your CTN trials, as well as some of the monitoring that we do of informed consent documentation and sort of ongoing management throughout the life cycle of a trial. So here on the slide, there are just 3 regulatory documents, I guess you could call them, that guide the content of the informed consent form, as well as the documentation requirements for the informed consent process. And in her presentation, Kedra gave a nice overview of obviously the FDA, and their regulations are defined in Part 50 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And then separately, the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, is in 45 CFR Part 46. And Section 116 is specific to the elements of informed consent. They're very similar between those 2 documents, and I'll show you an example in the upcoming slides. Within NIDA, we are a government agency, so the requirements in HHS, 45 CFR Part 46, always apply. And then, as you are aware, we only have some studies that are regulated by the FDA. And for those studies, any differing requirements or specific requirements particular to 21 CFR Part 50 also apply. And then in general, the ICH guidelines for good clinical practice are not technically a requirement, but they're very good guidelines that we do encourage investigators to follow within the CTN. Next slide, please. So what you're seeing here is a snippet from one of the documents that we have on the Investigator Toolbox. If you're not familiar with it, it's a fabulous resource that's available to folks within the CTN. This one is called Informed Consent, and it's available under the Protocol Development section of the Toolbox. So basically, it's a document that gives a closer look into the process of developing informed consent forms within the CTN, and it really gives you a good sense of why we ask for what we ask for when we're reviewing consent documents, and is supposed to help investigators know what sorts of elements to include in the ICF. And obviously, this is information that is checked by IRBs as well, and their institutional requirements, and many institutions have templates that speak to these requirements, but here they are, straight from the source. And as you can see, first here, I've got the basic elements of informed consent. So these are things like the reasonably foreseeable risks or discomforts of the study, the fact that participation is voluntary and things like that. And you can see that for many of these, verbatim are the same in the Code of Federal Regulations Part 50, which is the FDA guidelines, and then also the HHS guidelines. And I'm just noting here that this is just a screenshot. It's not an exhaustive list. Next slide, please. So in addition to the basic elements of informed consent, the regulations specify additional elements of informed consent, which, when appropriate, need to be included in the informed consent document. So within the CTN, we do require that these be included in the informed consent unless they're not applicable. So for example, number 7 here on the slide has to do with research involving biospecimens. So if your study is not collecting biospecimens, this one would not be applicable and we wouldn't require that. But for the other ones, we do check for those as part of our review process. So these include things like how many people are taking part in the study, what happens if you decide to withdraw, what costs might there be for participating, and things like that. Next slide, please. So lastly, I just wanted to quickly touch on some of the additional elements of informed consent that are required within the CTN in particular. So these aren't from the regulations, but they are, requirements for our own documents. So you'll see here that these are kind of specific to our sponsor and to our population that's being enrolled in our studies, and include things like a statement about NIDA data share, the information about the certificate of confidentiality, statements about participation of prisoners, if that's applicable to your study, and things like that. So we do also provide template language for these sorts of things that can help out when you're new to developing a consent form within the CTN. Next slide, please. So a couple things, and this is like a really long slide, so I would encourage you to go back and read this in the future. But just there are two sort of conceptual groups that have different recommendations. So the first being the initial development of the informed consent document. So within the CTN, the informed consent document development is the responsibility of the lead node. So they'll create the informed consent form and they'll send it over to the CCC, who reviews the consent document against this list of requirements that I've just presented to you. And for those of you who have done this before, you know the process well, I'm sure. The CCC might provide comments that something is missing or can be clarified, or potentially doesn't match the protocol and things like that. The review is done by the clinical study manager, as well as by our regulatory affairs staff like Kedra and our safety staff. So we have that cross-functional review here. Also, many of you already likely know this, but the process is to first develop the informed consent template, which gets IRB approved. The consent template goes out to the sites. The sites make their own adjustments as needed. And then the site level changes need to be reviewed by the CCC and the lead node before they can be submitted to the IRB at the site level. So regarding conformed consent development, I mentioned this before, but just making sure that the consent form matches the protocol. It's a pretty basic thing to think of, but sometimes it can be tricky. So it's important to sort of go through with a fine-tooth comb and make sure that it all makes sense. Also, we encourage minimization of opportunities for documentation errors. You can see on the slide, it's really small, but this is a little screenshot from a consent for a CTN trial that has to do with optional procedures. And there's sort of three groupings here: agreeing to future contact, sharing health information from the NDI, and genetics. And we've asked the participant to initial within each one of those groupings. And it's a little confusing. I think the way that it was set up, potentially it could have been improved, but at least it's consistent. We're asking for initials. Whereas sometimes we see consents that have like circling in one place and initialing in another place and signing in a third place, and that can get confusing and opens up opportunity for error. Another thing we do aim for, although it's very difficult to achieve, is a reading level of 8th grade or lower for the consent document. This is a function you can use in Word to check the reading level of your document. I already mentioned about the master ICF templates. We also encourage the lead investigators to follow the Code of Federal Regulations and the CCTN requirements up front when preparing the consent document, so that we can reduce turnaround time with CCC, and also to avoid two-part consent forms where possible. And then in terms of the informed consent process itself and documenting that process, these are more like site level tips and tricks, is to make sure that you're keeping track of the most recently IRB approved version of the consent form. Throughout the course of a study, when a protocol gets updated, the consent form gets updated, and sometimes participants need to be reconsented, or you just need to make sure in general that if you've got printed copies of your consent form, you're using the most up-to-date one. So that's really important to keep track of and double check. You also want to make sure that the people at your site who are administering the informed consent are authorized to do so, meaning that they're delegated appropriately on the delegation log, unless you have a waiver of written consent. And also, goes back to what I was saying before about the additional fields, just making sure that they're completed. A lot of sites implement a practice where they have a second person just go through and check the consent form to make sure everything that needs to be completed is done before the participant leaves the clinic. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's our pop quiz. This is to see if you were paying attention. So what I put here is an excerpt from a CTN informed consent form. And I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to ask you to answer which element of informed consent you think the statement satisfies. So it says, if you're injured or harmed by the study drug or study procedures, you will be treated. The study site and the sponsor do not offer any financial compensation or payment for the cost of treatment if you're injured or harmed as a result of participating in this research. Therefore, any medical treatments you need may be billed to you or your insurance. However, you are not prevented from seeking to collect compensation for injury related to negligence on the part of those involved in the research. So, Maura, do you want to give us the quiz if you could? Oh, darn.
It would be helpful if I unmuted myself. I'm really sorry about that. All right. I am relaunching the poll. Is it showing up for everyone?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'll give you like a minute for everyone to think about this one.
Okay, I think when you're ready, Maura, you can, I don't know if it lets you share the results, but you can put the slides back up and we can look at the results there.
Okay, I'm gonna end the poll and I will say, let's just give it like 10 more seconds. All right, so we got 15 responses, 12 of the 15 selected C as the correct answer, and we got some answers of A and D. So let me share my screen again.
Thank you. And those of you who answered C, you're correct. I put in some other trick responses, so that was a good one. And I'm seeing that we only have like a couple minutes left, so I'm not sure if there's any questions right now on consent. I can blaze through some of the other high-level topics for IRB and Reg Docs in the last couple minutes.
Oh, I don't know why this keeps going back to the front. I'm sorry, everyone.
That's okay.
Okay.
There,
So,
yep. So we can just skip over this, but it's
okay.
here for reference, some resources. And on the next slide, just a quick note, IRBs are really important in governing the oversight of clinical trials. They really, their main job is to make sure that the subjects who are taking part in research are protected, their rights and welfare in particular. And the IRB can either approve your study, they can require modifications to your study in order to secure approval, or they can disapprove your study. And in the CTN, the IRB plays a really key role. If you go to the next slide, This is just an overview of the regulations. So Kedra had mentioned this earlier. Basically, both the HHS and the FDA regulations have very similar information about the role that the IRB plays in overseeing research, some exemptions from IRB requirement and things like that. So you can go in and look at those on your own time. I'm not going to go through that. Next slide, please. And similarly to consent, the ICH GCP Good Clinical Practice Guidelines also provide information on the role the IRB should play, or ethics committee in governing the conduct of a clinical trial. Next slide, please. So here I just put a little snippet from the CTN policies and procedures about IRB oversight. Very helpful resource for folks wanting to get a better understanding of the role that the IRB plays in the CTN. I'm also wanted to highlight the fact that the lead investigator is responsible for IRB management in the CTN. So that would include picking the IRB and doing all the submissions to the IRB. Next slide, please. Just a couple quick things. When you are picking an IRB, it's really important to get one with relevant experience. So within the CTN, this means those IRBs that have overseen studies using controlled substances or individuals who use substances. You got to make sure if you're going to allow folks who become a prisoner to stay in your study that you have OHRP prisoner certification, and in order to get that, the IRB needs to provide a prisoner representative. So that's something to confirm up front. A little bit separately is that you got to make sure that you choose sites who can rely on the single IRB as the IRB of record. And what I meant to mention that in the previous slide is that within the CTN, we follow the NIH guideline for single IRB. And so that is a requirement for our studies. Next slide, please. And I don't know that we have time for this.
Yeah, we only have a few minutes left, so I think maybe just going over the scenario and why would you select one response over another? Would that be better?
Yeah. Okay. So this is a situation that has occurred before, though luckily not very frequently, where a participant signed the consent form, they completed screening, and they got randomized in the study to receive drug A. And this is a double-blind randomized controlled trial operating under an IND. After they were randomized, the site uncovered that the liver function tests performed at screening were out of range based on the criteria defined in the study protocol. And the participant was deemed to be ineligible. Luckily, this was discovered before they had their first dose of the drug. So I made it a grand assumption here that you all would realize this is a major protocol deviation because an ineligible participant was randomized. And as such, the IRB's reporting guidelines indicate that major protocol deviations need to be reported to the IRB within 10 days of discovery, in particular for this specific IRB. So that would be what the site should do, which is answer B here. We can just skip this. I guess I don't think we have time, but this would be a good resource for folks to refer back to. Basically, we collect essential regulatory documents in the CTN, and sites will be trained on how to do that and what they need to complete. So I don't want to keep folks over. I know we're out of time. I'm sorry, we're not going to go to this.
Well, I will go through the remaining slides and just want to remind everyone that the slide deck as well as the presentation is being recorded and so will be posted in its entirety. How many more slides do we have left? Do you know, Julia? From here?
There's only one after this. It's a quiz.
Oh, okay. So out of respect for everyone's time, if you need to drop off, we completely understand. Julia, if you wanted to just finish up the last couple of slides, we can make sure everyone gets, access to this recording.
Yeah, sure. So I guess with that in mind, do you want to go back 2 slides?
Yes, let's do that. Okay.
Okay. So I sort of did a very quick overview of this, but in the CTN, we do collect what we call essential regulatory documents. These are defined in the ICH guidelines for good clinical practice. And they're essentially those documents that individually and collectively permit evaluation of the conduct of a trial and the quality of the data that are produced. They're really important because they demonstrate compliance of the site PI sponsor and monitor with not only the ICH E6 guidelines, but also the regulations. These documents are subject to audits by authorized parties such as the FDA and sponsor. They need to be established at the beginning of a trial and maintained throughout the conduct of the trial. And then at the end of the trial, they need to be archived per institutional and sponsor requirements. Usually that means whichever one is longer. And I just quickly wanted to note that this is a little bit different than the full trial master file or TMF, though sometimes it gets referenced as such. Next slide, please. So here's a list of essential documents in the CTN. Many of these are documents that we require across the board for all of our CTN studies. That would be, including things like IRB approval letters, informed consent forms, the protocol signature page, site delegation log, and things like that, the FWA. And then some of these are required only in certain circumstances, such as when there's an IND study that would create a requirement for the 1572, as well as a financial disclosure form. And if there's a lab being used, we would need to collect laboratory documents like a CLIA certificate and reference ranges. And if there's a controlled substance being used in the study, like buprenorphine, we would require, and it's being provided for the purpose of the research and not per standard of care, we would require the DEA individual license and the DEA receipt of medication, which sometimes can be the same thing. And then we also collect site staff documents like GCP and HSP training, licenses, and things like that. And all of this is told to staff at the beginning of a trial. The CCC prepares a list of required regulatory documents and rules with the lead node, and that's provided to sites. And it's really a great resource that has information about how to complete your site essential regulatory documents and how to submit them and things like that. And the CCC is available as well for questions that come up regarding essential document requirements in the CTN. So here's a couple, oh, sorry, can you go back?
Yeah, sorry.
I kept talking. So this is just a couple things that we've noticed and wanted to share relevant to site essential documents. The first one being that the site essential documents are all intertwined. They all have information that's sort of found across several different documents. The 1572 is an obvious example where it collects information about the investigator, the location or locations where the study will be conducted, the clinical lab facilities, the IRB, the sub-investigators, and so forth. And we also collect several other documents on those, like the lab certificates, the IRB documentation, CVs, and financial disclosure forms from the investigators.
Dr. Mancino, our guest here today who wanted to talk for a few minutes from the legal aid.
And just a reminder for folks to stay on mute for the next couple of minutes. And so I just wanted to emphasize that it's important for sites to do their own cross-referencing of these documents and make sure that, the names and facilities and addresses match, because if they don't, we will tell you and we're going to ask you to fix them. So it's good to just do that up front to reduce the back and forth. And similarly, we also cross-reference other documents like the delegation log and the training documentation form. So we look at those, for each staff member and make sure that the staff is trained for the roles that they are delegated on the delegation log and that they have all the appropriate documentation they need on file. So like if they're delegated to be shipping biological specimens, we're going to check for their IATA certification. And now you can go to the next slide. So,
Sorry.
That's okay. So this is a pop quiz about which of the following essential regulatory documents are not required for an IND study. This is a trick question. I think folks might see this list and be inclined to answer E, that they're all required. But in fact, the answer is D. The caveat being that CVs are only required for staff that are listed on the 1572 and not for all staff that are listed on the delegation log. Okay. And I think that's the last slide. And I know we're over time.